In the late 2000s, America's truck industry stood at a crossroads. New emissions laws were coming, diesel engines were changing fast, and every manufacturer was scrambling to find a way forward. Cummins, Detroit Diesel, Volvo, and PACCAR all followed one path: selective catalytic reduction, or SCR. But Navistar International, the company once known for building the indestructible DT-466, decided to go its own way. They called their answer MaxxForce, and they promised it would revolutionize diesel power again. Cleaner, simpler, and tougher than anything on the road. Instead, it nearly destroyed the company. This is the story of how Navistar tried to outsmart the entire trucking industry, and how that gamble turned one of America's oldest engine makers into a cautionary tale. By the early 2000s, Navistar International still carried the legacy of the old international harvester empire. The DT-466 was legendary. It powered everything from school buses and grain trucks to fire engines and combines. Mechanics trusted it. Fleet managers swore by it. In small towns across America, the DT-466 was the diesel. But by 2004, a new challenge loomed: EPA emission standards that targeted nitrogen oxides and particulates. The diesel industry had to evolve. Every major manufacturer faced the same question: how do you make a diesel engine cleaner without killing its reliability? Cummins, Detroit Diesel, and Volvo all reached the same conclusion: after treatment. They adopted SCR systems, which used a liquid urea mixture, diesel exhaust fluid or DEF, to chemically convert harmful nitrogen oxides into nitrogen and water after combustion. It worked. Navistar, however, had other ideas. Inside Navistar's headquarters in Warrenville, Illinois, executives were wary of SCR. They didn't want customers to deal with DEF fluid, tanks, heaters, or sensors. They saw it as a headache. One more thing to refill and repair. And they feared the system's complexity would turn off loyal buyers used to simple mechanical engines. Instead, Navistar's engineers pursued a different solution. One they believed would keep things simple. They called it Advanced Exhaust Gas Recirculation, or EGR. EGR wasn't new. It worked by recirculating a portion of exhaust gas back into the engine's intake, lowering combustion temperatures and reducing nitrogen oxide formation. But while EGR was fine for light-duty engines, scaling it up for Class 8 trucks was something no one had ever tried, at least not to the extreme levels Navistar envisioned. The idea was bold. The MaxxForce line would meet the EPA's 2010 emissions standards without DEF, without SCR, and without complex aftertreatment, just pure in-cylinder control. On paper, Navistar's EGR-only strategy looked elegant. No extra tanks, no frozen DEF lines, no sensor faults. And for drivers, one less thing to worry about. But under the hood, the reality was brutal. To reduce nitrogen oxides using EGR alone, Navistar had to push recirculation rates far higher than any other manufacturer. Up to 40% of exhaust gases fed back into the intake. That meant the engines were constantly rebreathing hot, sooty exhaust. To keep combustion temperatures down, EGR coolers had to remove enormous amounts of heat. To maintain power, the turbochargers had to work overtime to cram more oxygen into that hot, dense mix. It was an engineering balancing act on a knife's edge. In the lab, it could be made to work. Barely. In the field, hauling freight across the Rockies or idling for hours in Phoenix heat, it turned into a disaster. The first MaxxForce engines began rolling out in 2008. They were designed to meet the 2010 emissions deadline early, giving Navistar a marketing edge. The names sounded bold and modern: MaxxForce 7, MaxxForce 9, MaxxForce 13, each representing displacement or configuration. Underneath, though, these engines were heavily re-engineered versions of older platforms. The MaxxForce 13, for example, was based on a joint design with MAN, the German truck manufacturer. It featured a compounded turbocharger setup, where a small high-pressure turbo fed into a larger low-pressure unit, all designed to maintain boost under extreme EGR load. But no amount of clever turbocharging could offset the fundamental problem: heat and soot. The engines ran hot, brutally hot. EGR coolers failed, valves burned, turbos cracked, and soot built up in the intake and exhaust paths, choking airflow. And because the engines ran with constant recirculated exhaust, oil contamination skyrocketed. Owners found themselves changing oil twice as often and replacing EGR coolers, sensors, and turbos like they were consumables. Mechanics hated working on them. Drivers called them unreliable. Fleets began to lose patience. But Navistar's leadership refused to back down. Even as field failures piled up, they insisted the technology just needed further refinement. Internally, the company's emissions engineers were raising alarms. They knew that with every software update, the engines were being pushed closer to the edge, retuned again and again to chase emissions compliance without breaking hardware. But by 2010, the writing was on the wall. Navistar was the only major manufacturer without an EPA-certified SCR engine. Their MaxxForce line technically met emissions standards only through credits earned from earlier compliance years. Those credits were running out. When the credits expired, Navistar found itself in a regulatory corner. The EPA began fining the company for every non-compliant engine sold. Navistar's trucks had to be shipped with stickers, warning buyers that the engines were subject to penalties under federal law. Still, management insisted that SCR was a band-aid, and that Navistar's EGR-only approach would eventually prove superior. It didn't. The field failures became lawsuits. Fleets like Swift, Knight, and Werner dropped Navistar trucks from their rosters. Owner-operators posted videos of catastrophic engine failures. Dealerships struggled to keep up with warranty claims, often waiting weeks for replacement EGR coolers or sensors. The brand that once defined American reliability had become a punchline. In 2012, Navistar's chief executive officer Dan Oustian, the man who had championed the EGR-only path, resigned. The company had spent billions chasing an impossible dream, and the fallout was catastrophic. Navistar's market share in heavy-duty trucks collapsed from over 25% to barely 10%. Warranty costs ballooned to over $700 million in a single year. The company's stock, once near $70 a share, plunged below $20. And perhaps worst of all, the MaxxForce name, once meant to represent strength, became synonymous with failure. But to understand why this disaster hit so hard, you have to look at what Navistar used to be. This was the company that built the Farmall, the Scout, the Paystar, and the DT-466. They had been the backbone of American agriculture, construction, and transport for nearly a century. Their engineers had built engines that outlasted generations, from the reliable 400 series diesels of the 1970s to the truck platforms that hauled freight from coast to coast. So when Navistar bet its future on the MaxxForce project, it wasn't just a product decision, it was a philosophical one. They were betting that their in-house engineering heritage could beat a global trend, that they could make emissions compliance a mechanical solution rather than a chemical one. By late 2012, Navistar finally conceded. They announced that future MaxxForce engines would incorporate Cummins SCR technology, the very system they had spent years calling unnecessary. But the damage was already done. Fleets had moved on, warranty costs had gutted profits, and the once proud company was now dependent on its competitors for technology. What had begun as a bold attempt to lead the industry ended as a desperate fight for survival. When Navistar finally admitted defeat in 2012, the damage wasn't just mechanical, it was existential. A company that once built engines for tanks, tractors, and trucks now had to buy its emission systems from its rivals. After years of insisting that SCR was too complicated, Navistar quietly announced a new partnership with Cummins. Future MaxxForce engines, they said, would use Cummins after-treatment systems to meet emission standards. The announcement read like a press release, but to the men who had built their careers on the old International Harvester legacy, it felt like a confession. The EGR-only dream was over. An EGR system works by feeding exhaust gases back into the intake. That exhaust is mostly carbon dioxide, water vapor, and unburned hydrocarbons. And crucially, it displaces oxygen. Less oxygen means lower combustion temperature, which means less nitrogen oxide formation. But it also means incomplete combustion, higher soot production, and more internal contamination. In a light-duty diesel, where EGR rates hover around 10 to 15%, this is manageable. In a heavy-duty engine recirculating 40% of its exhaust, it's a chemical war inside the cylinders. The MaxxForce engines had to fight this war constantly. The exhaust gas was so hot that the EGR coolers, which had to drop the temperature by hundreds of degrees before sending it back to the intake, were pushed to their limit. When they failed, coolant leaked into the intake manifold, often causing catastrophic engine damage. When the system was working perfectly, the combustion chamber ran so sooty that diesel particulate filters clogged faster than expected. When it wasn't, it threw the engine into regeneration mode, burning extra fuel to clean the filter, raising temperatures, stressing components, and driving up fuel consumption. Drivers called it the EGR death cycle. Hotter combustion led to cracked heads. Clogged coolers led to failed turbos. Failed turbos led to regeneration cycles that overheated sensors. It was an endless loop of frustration. Navistar had promised simplicity. What they delivered was a system that required near-perfect conditions to survive. Inside Navistar's research labs, engineers were burning through prototypes at an alarming rate. They tried thicker head gaskets, new coolant routing, upgraded turbo seals. They ran tests around the clock, trying to keep EGR temperatures under control without sacrificing horsepower. Each fix bought a little time, but only that. The fundamental physics couldn't be cheated. To meet 2010 EPA limits without SCR, Navistar would have had to push EGR efficiency to levels that simply didn't exist in a real-world operating environment. And the EPA wasn't interested in almost clean. You were either compliant, or you weren't. For a while, Navistar used emissions credits from earlier, cleaner models to keep selling trucks, but those credits were finite, a kind of environmental currency that was supposed to bridge the gap between generations. When they ran out, Navistar had no compliant product to replace the MaxxForce. The company began paying civil penalties for every non-compliant engine sold, hoping to buy enough time to redesign its system before the fines overwhelmed it. But the math didn't work. Navistar's losses reached nearly $1 billion by 2013. The company that once defined America's diesel heartland was bleeding cash. Then came the lawsuits. Fleets that had bought hundreds of MaxxForce-powered trucks filed suits claiming fraud and misrepresentation. They argued that Navistar knew the engines couldn't meet real-world reliability targets and sold them anyway. In 2019, Navistar agreed to pay $135 million to settle a national class action lawsuit involving more than 66,000 trucks. Several states filed separate claims, leading to additional settlements totaling tens of millions. After Chief Executive Officer Dan Ustian resigned in 2012, Navistar scrambled for a way forward. Troy Clark, a General Motors veteran, took over as Chief Executive Officer. His message was clear: survival first. Navistar would adopt SCR across all platforms, rebuild relationships with fleets, and restore quality. The engines were rebranded as International A26 and N Series, reflecting their MAN lineage and new Cummins after-treatment systems. For the first time in nearly a decade, Navistar's trucks were reliable again. In the end, the MaxxForce story isn't just about engineering. It's about what happens when conviction turns into stubbornness, when a company mistakes confidence for infallibility. The same pride that built the DT466, the same independence that made International Harvester an industrial giant, became the flaw that brought it down. The MaxxForce wasn't just an engine that failed. It was a mirror, showing an entire company what it had become. Today, when a modern international truck passes by, powered by a quiet, efficient SCR engine, it carries the ghost of that era under its hood. The logo is the same. The name is the same. But the soul is different. Because in 2010, Navistar didn't just lose a battle with emissions. It lost the belief that American diesel engineering could survive without compromise. And that's what makes the story of MaxxForce more than just a failure. It's a tragedy. The moment when one of America's greatest engine makers discovered that even legends can break.